Well, thank you, Damien and Colin, for those very in-depth presentations on case studies throughout. There are quite a few questions in Slido that we're going to pose to you. But before we do that, I just had another, just listening to you, both of you talk, and especially, I'm just thinking back on my own experience and some of my regulatory experiences here in Canada. Whenever we talked about putting material within the stream, that usually conjured up a pretty big no-no from a regulatory side of our way of operating. So I'm curious to understand the regulatory considerations that you folks had to consider when addressing this type of work.
Uh, yeah, I should have mentioned it up front. Really engaging the regulators has been a critical part of what we do. And we're working with our Water Quality Board and the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, as well as our federal endangered species folks, getting them out to projects, walking them through the science, really engaging them in trainings that we're hosting. And uh, so all of that is a really critical component to this for questions about sediment issues, about disturbance to sensitive habitat, and of course fish passage. And these have all been things we've been able to work through from my experience in California. But they definitely require outreach, a really strong outreach campaign to really engage regulators along the way.
I'm just practicing my pausing instead of jumping in. Okay, we're going to go to the first question here, and it's lots of great examples of success, but do you have any examples of failure and what the root causes were? And I guess that goes to you, all of you, at some point talking about being willing to experiment, and with that make mistakes. So I think this question is, what kind of mistakes have you guys made, and what did you learn from them? I know none of you made
Uh,
mistakes. That's okay, but somebody had to make a mistake. I know. Look at Paul. You look like a guy that's made mistakes before. What have you
I
done?
was going
Come
to
on.
say, you saw Janine's presentation, right? That was our 20-year history of mistakes. Absolutely, and that is the true learning. I think having professionals that can come out and look at each other's projects and evaluate them critically, and not just show off what we think we're proud of and what we think the best stuff is, but go look at those mistakes. And Janine described it very well earlier. A lot of times those mistakes are the happy accidents, right? If we slow down, take a breath, and digest it a little bit, it's not as bad. We beat ourselves up. We used to, at least back in the day when things didn't go exactly like we expected. But if we give it a chance and put things into context, we can learn quite a bit from them and learn that maybe these mistakes weren't quite as bad as we thought they were. So now I mess up on purpose.
Now that Paul broached that, anybody else want to weigh in, or you want? Should we just nicely go to the next question?
I,
Go
Uh,
ahead, Colin.
I think the mistakes in projects I've been involved in is generally making the channels too big. Um, I think there was a fear about flooding and about erosion, and so the feeling was, well, make the channel a bit bigger, and then if it does anything, it'll silt a bit, but it won't erode and give us caving banks and the sort of things that stakeholders hate to see. And the River Neath in Wales is a classic example of that. We put the restored channel in, we made it bigger than we thought it was necessary. And you know what it did? It created a big sediment trap. It starved the channel downstream of sediment and generated head cuts, and exactly what we didn't want. And I think that's an example of the fact that the safe side isn't always the side you think it is. And I think if I had to make a recommendation with regard to awarding mistakes, I'd say make the channels too small, but definitely not too big. Smaller channels will enlarge. That happens easily, but channels that are too big are going to take a long time to settle down, because they'll initiate cycles of erosion and fill, which will perpetuate themselves for decades.
All right, I'll go to the next question on our Slido list here, and it's about the South Fork project. It's asking, will you not eventually lose your place substrate as the dam blocks gravel recruitment? And the follow-up question, are these restored braided channels sufficiently wetted during summer for drought and fish passage?
Well, those are two very pertinent questions. In the design, and Paul was involved in this, so I'll defer to him. But as I understand it, there were some specific features introduced at the edges of the anastomose system where it met the valley side, and I think they were called shunts. And essentially, they're artificial landslides, and they will be local sources of gravel as the stream chews away at the toes of those features. And we're not flushing gravel through here at a huge rate of speed anymore, and therefore the actual flux rates are pretty small, but they're not zero. Potentially at some time in the future, because as you say, Cougar Dam traps all the gravel, potentially then there might be a need for a gravel augmentation project. But you know what? This is not a rewilded river. It's got a dam on it. We're not ever going to be able to leave it to its own devices and expect it to perform in terms of supporting fish in the way that we want it to. And if in 20 years' time we need to do some gravel augmentation, I wouldn't say that's bad in terms of operations and maintenance. No projects last forever, including river restoration projects. Now I forgot what the second question was.
Yeah, the second one was, are these restored braided
Oh.
channels sufficiently wetted during summer drought for fish passage?
Well, yeah. First one, I don't want to be a pedant, but I guess I sort of am. They're not really braided. They're anabranching or anastomosed. The braided channel has one channel with multiple sub-channels within it, but there's one bankful discharge. An anastomosed channel or an anabranch channel has separate channels which act almost independently of each other and which each have their own bankful discharge. So they're not really braided, they're more anastomosed, I would say. And those sorts of channels are not as dynamic as braided channels, anything like. And they do, because the anastocism is a function of the biology as well as the physics, they have that wonderful thing that only biology has, which is a recuperative power. And so they tend to recover their own form when disturbed through biological processes. They literally rebuild themselves. And anything that doesn't destroy the ecosystem makes it stronger. So they do have true resilience. They will get hit by floods, they will get hit by fires, there will be flood mosaics, there will be fire mosaics, and at the end of the day, there will be biodiversity coming out of the, coming beyond our wildest dreams.
But Colin, I'll follow up specifically just to highlight the point of the question. I think the target of it was during a summer drought. Does it drive some kind of secondary problem for fish around fish passage? I saw, Paul, you were signaling on that one. Do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I could touch on that real quick. The short answer is no. So our actual depths post-project are deeper. The mean depths and maximum depths are both deeper than the pre-project depths were. So no, there's none of the passage problems for salmon or anything else on that landscape. And like Colin showed, that the Chinook are moving into there and then they're spawning at those sites at the end of the summer. So very heavily used by the adult salmon in that area.
Can I just?
And this is not to do with the hyperrios, with the river below. That's that's not slow water, that's dead slow water, because it's moving at a hundredth to a thousandth of the velocity of the above ground river that's flowing at centimeters and meters per second. This is flowing at millimeters or less per second. This is really slow water. It's recharged during the wet winter. It then releases that water very gradually through springs and through influent processes through the rest of the summer. So, for instance, at Whitefish Creek, the base flows were really, really low and in the summer, and they have come up. And well, fortunately, unfortunately, the people who own the water rights now take that water because they can take it. They couldn't take it before because there wasn't any, and so the stream flows haven't recovered that much. But certainly the summer low flows are higher than they used to be.
All right, Dale, back to you.
Sure. Okay, we'll go to the next question. What are your recommendations in cases where there is infrastructure along the river that needs to be protected? Highway, pipeline, nuclear plant, I think is the running example. Especially when there are constraints on both sides. Is there a quasi-process-based approach that could still be taken? Or is this just a place and time that we need to check what the expectations are about delivery of restoration and what can be achieved? I added that last part in.
Well, while somebody else is answering this, if this is where maybe my urban restoration slides could pop up. For 8 years of my life, I headed a couple of research consortia on blue-green cities and the value of blue-green infrastructure, and seeing urban streams as blue-green infrastructure, not just grey infrastructure with a drainage function. And what we've got here, I'm going to turn my phone back on. And it's just reconnecting. Okay. Yeah, what we've got here is to think about the fact that we've got a complete spectrum of restoration environments here, going from wildlands, truly wildlands, through semi-natural anthromes, all the way through to really dense settlements. And clearly, if we're talking about appropriate restoration strategies, then they must be fitted to the biome or the anthrome within which they exist. And you know, we're part of biology too, and we get to have our own biomes called anthromes. But all of the evidence, and the jury is now back, all of the evidence is that the more nature you can bring into your anthrome, the healthier and more productive your population will be. They'll have fewer sick days, they'll be more creative in their thinking, they'll make your city outcompete the other grey city that doesn't have much nature in it. So we know this is good to do, but clearly what we're going to have to do is fit the type of restoration to the anthrome or biome that we're operating in. There isn't one size fits all, but it is a spectrum, and it's going to be very, very rare that you're completely in a wildland or that you're in a completely densely developed settlement where there really is no space for nature. Those are going to be pretty extremes. Now, in the wildland end, we know for sure that if we rehydrate floodplains, if we slow the flow, and talking about this sort of idea of skinny water, that if we have too many channels and too wide a wetland, we won't have enough water to go around. Just think about continuity. The flow of the discharge of water is the velocity times the cross-sectional area. So if you have the same flow of water and you reduce the velocity by a factor of 10, you increase the cross-sectional area by a factor of 10. It is just continuity. And it looks almost like magic that things like Whitefish Creek, that used to be as dry as a bone, just with a dribble of water down the middle of it in the summer, now there's water all over the place, but it's not flowing very fast. And that's how you get over the skinny water problem. So can you do this in areas where you've got nuclear power stations on both banks? Well, yes. Here's the centre of Belfast. We're right in downtown Belfast, the Connswater Community Greenway, and look at it. It's super. It's got a nice channel. It's got attached wetlands. The houses are up on the terraces, and the floodway between the terrace on the left and there's a flood embankment on the right is designed to convey the 100-year flood or whatever its design capacity is. And it won the River Restoration Centre prize a couple of years ago, and the local people absolutely love it. Closer to home, Fano Creek in Portland in Washington County, absolute classic stage 3S arrested degradation in size, washed out beaver dams, little sediment, minimum erosion and recovery, minimum floodplain connectivity. Fano Creek, the beaver are back. They were actually reintroduced by Clean Water Services, the local water company, and it's transformative. And maybe the best example of all, Bethany Creek, also in Portland, a stream corridor enhancement project, looks a bit of a mess. Nature loves a mess. This is an anastomosing channel within an urban area, and it's got room for just about everything, including the people on the cycle paths and the bridges, which are heavily used. The only things we're lacking are the wolves and the bears, and we can't have those back. But everything else is back in this very constrained space. So, it can be done.
Example. Does anybody else want to add anything? Otherwise, I'll go to Jason for the next question. Over to you, Jason.
Hey, well, I'm going to just go down the list a little bit because this question's been sitting on our holding board for a while. And it's around, how do I take this stuff and do something with it? And the question's around, is there a best practices handbook that Stream Keepers, and so for our panel, Stream Keepers in British Columbia is a, what would I call it, a volunteer army of people of varying technical skill sets. Some as skilled as some of you on the panel, and some probably as skilled as my dad, who likes nature, and that's about the extent of his technical competence. So what references or manuals or guidance would we be able to direct people to start to understand this kind of thinking and put it into applied action? And Janine, I know you had a bunch of resources that you mentioned in your talk. Maybe we could start with you to give us a bit of a curated kind of pointed guide to where should people look as a start, and then we can see if other panelists want to comment further.
Sure. There isn't, I wouldn't say there's one great place that you can go to for a guidebook. I don't think we're there yet. There's also the concern of putting out a guidebook and then not having the training to go with it, not having the community of practitioners around you to help review your projects. And this is something the Forest Service has done really well, is working with the group, evaluating each other's projects, learning from that. So I would direct you toward resources. It's a bit self-serving, but I am the technical director of the Portland State University River Restoration Professional Certificate Program, which looks kind of broadly through for the ecology, physical processes, engineering, and so forth. That broader look at restoration. There are also short courses out there. I know that Paul and Colin and Damien and lots of other folks teach these. There are courses at Utah State. So I think it's really probably the more important thing than reading some sort of guidance document is to take some of these courses, start building your network, getting out and seeing some of the projects in the field. And if at all possible, get out during construction, see how it's being done. Because there is design that goes into this. There's a lot of field fitting, there's a lot of field discovery. So that would be my guidance, is don't rely on just published papers and written guidebooks and so forth, because this practice is evolving pretty rapidly. And it really is, I think, that the community of practice that is so important. Well,
that's really helpful, and it sounds like something I like to think I'd think of on my own, but probably wouldn't always. So much appreciated. Would others on the panel like to comment on this? We're just coming up to break time, but if you have a short comment that builds on what Janine shared, we've got time for it.
I'll add that Colin's got a really nice website, StageZeroRiverRestoration.com. So he and his friends have compiled a bunch of resources on that website, from papers to projects. So there's a lot of resources there to go to. And then as far as seeing projects, like Janine said, there's nothing, the photos are one thing, but come out and walk something and really dive into it, it's much, much different. And then also seeing it during construction is very, very valuable, because when you do your first, you're going to have a tremendous amount of anxiety. But if you can see that on someone else's project first, it lessens that pain quite a bit.
All right, well, I think, go ahead, Colin.
I'd just give a shout out for River Restoration Northwest, which is a really good community of practice, and their annual symposiums, Country Mile, the best recurring conference I've ever been to. It's well worth coming to, whatever your background.
Super.
All right, well, that's been great. We're going to take a short break again and just give everybody a chance to stretch their legs. So we will reconvene with our last talk for the day at 2:45, and we'll be coming back to Paul. So we'll see you all in about 13 minutes.